beginning of my career as a chaplain in a juvenile hall, I got to work with many volunteers, and most of them came from churches. Most of the churches they came from were fairly fundamentalist. There was one woman who came to mind as I was working on the sermon for today, and she was from a fundamentalist church and believed that men had an odd number of ribs. And that was because Adam lost a rib in the making of Eve, and so they had one fewer rib than women do. I wondered why she never confirmed this theory with her husband. Maybe because he was ticklish. I don't think I ever had a literalist understanding of these stories. I'm not sure why I didn't. I might have developed one as a child when most thinking and therefore most believing is quite concrete, but I didn't. Perhaps my parents told me they were just stories. Just like Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel was make-believe, and there was never really a bull named Ferdinand who liked to sit under the cork tree, Adam and Eve were make-believe, and the stories of the garden were just that, stories. Later, I saw them as stories about obedience and disobedience, which may have been a little bit of projection on my part. That was sort of during my adolescence when I was dealing with issues of obedience and disobedience with my parents. But, that is just sort of a little psychological evaluation there. Eventually, I came to see them, primarily these two stories, or especially these two stories we heard today, as many things, but primarily as allegory. I see these stories as allegory about maturation, particularly about sexual maturation. Our story starts out with Yahweh putting the Adam in the garden, and you can't see my manuscript, but I used a little a for Adam because it's not a name at this point, it is a description. It is a general term. Human, in fact, would probably be a better translation than man. This being doesn't get a gender until the whole rib thing happens. So the human being is in the garden, and God sees the human is lonely, and God starts creating animals. All of the animals are paraded before the human, and they're cool, but not really partner material. So God does the whole rib thing, and at last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, a true partner. These two humans get genders. It actually comes about because of some Hebrew wordplay, ish and isha. Ish for man and isha drawn out of man because, the whole rib thing. It's a pun, what can I say? I love how this first story ends. Ish and isha are both naked, and they are not ashamed. The next story, things change. Though Isha hadn't been created when God told the Adam not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she apparently knew the rule. And so does the serpent, I guess. I like the way Nadia Bolz-Weber retells the story. We don't really know if all the animals could talk back then, or if it, for some reason, was just the snake. But the snake was a crafty SOB, and he wanted to stir up some crap, so in an epic display of triangulation, he decided to gossip with Eve about God. Like an episode of Real Serpents of Eden County, he slithered up to her and was like, honey, I totally love you, right? I mean, it's like the only reason I'm saying this, but did God really say to you you weren't allowed to eat of one of these here trees? I mean, did God really say that to you? And Eve replied, well, kind of, I guess. I mean, we can eat of any tree. God just said that there's one in the middle, and this is weird. We can't even touch it, which is not one of the original things. But anyway, we can't even touch it or else we'll die. The serpent saw his opening. Shut up! God said that? I mean, I know you guys are friends, but girl, you totally won't die. God only said that because God knows if you eat from the tree, you would be like God, knowing good from evil. It actually makes you feel kind of sorry for God, you know? Eve saw that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was beautiful, and the fruit tasty, and the wisdom it promised desirable. So she ate of the fruit, and just to be clear, her unbelievably passive husband, who didn't do or say any of this stuff, ate it too. Rather than living in the freedom God gave them to just be who they were, they listened to a voice other than God's, and they believed the serpent and traded life for knowledge of good and evil. The moment they ate of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, their eyes were open, and the freedom of life, the freedom just being with God as God created beings, allowing God to be God and we to be they who are in need of God, vanished. Which is exactly the moment the idea of nakedness was introduced. Before then, it didn't exist. But now the humans covered their bodies out of shame, which is exactly how shame operates. It makes us hate our bodies. It obscures the image of God within us. It makes us hide. It makes us afraid of God. It makes us blame others. The next day, God was kind of strolling around the garden and realized the earthlings were nowhere to be found. So God called out, hey, you guys! But they were hiding. Before the weight of good and evil and the legalistic bullshit that has forever plagued religion entered into the minds and hearts of human beings, there was no shame. No shame about our bodies, or what those bodies desired, or how those bodies looked. There was absolutely no reason to hide from God. But rather than just be with God as we were created, the humans chose to try to be like God. And that crap has not stopped to this day. We love taking our so-called knowledge of what is good and what is evil, of who is good and who is evil, and applying it to ourselves and to others like we were God. The very first expression of shame was over our nakedness, over our sexual bodies. And since then, we earthlings have tried to define and control and condemn human sexuality. Shame has an origin, and it is not God. When Adam and Eve tried to avoid God, God said, "Where are you?" And they said, "We are naked, and we tried to hide from you because we were afraid." And then God said, "Wait, who told you you were naked? Who told them they were naked? My money is on the snake, and he's a damn liar." Historically, when Christians have thought about the banishment from the Garden of Eden, the focus has been on the sins of disobedience and pride. "Don't eat the fruit of that tree," God told the Adam. "Why do kids put beans in their ears? They do it because you say no." Of course they'll disobey the commandment. Of course they'll be disobedient. Though God says don't, wasn't the only reason they did it. Eat the fruit, the serpent told Isha, and you'll be like God. Like the pride exhibited in the Tower of Babel story that comes just a few chapters later in Genesis, the desire to be like God, to think too much of yourself, is a problem. And what we failed to notice is that the other end of that spectrum is also a problem. And it's in this story too. Shame, the feeling that one is bad and unworthy, is also a problem. Shame is destructive. Brene Brown, who may be America's greatest expert on shame, differentiates between guilt and shame. I believe guilt is adaptive and helpful. It holds something we've done or failed to do up against our values and feeling psychological discomfort, she writes. I define shame as the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. Something we've experienced, done, or failed to do makes us unworthy of connection. I don't believe shame is helpful or productive. In fact, I think shame is much more likely to be the source of destructive, hurtful behavior than the solution or cure. I think the fear of disconnection can make us dangerous. In other words, guilt can be helpful and productive. Healthy guilt allows us to seek forgiveness and to correct a wrong. It can lead to healing. On the other hand, shame causes us to fear rejection and tempts us to hide and disconnect from others and to avoid what causes us shame. In an interview with Oprah Winfrey, Brown said, "I think shame is lethal. I think shame is deadly. I think we are swimming in it deep. And here's the bottom line with shame. The less you talk about it, the more you get it." Shame needs three things to grow exponentially in our lives: secrecy, silence, and judgment. When we keep quiet about our shame, Brown says, it grows. It will creep into every corner and crevice of your life. The antidote, Brown says, is empathy. She explains that by talking about your shame with a friend who expresses empathy, the painful feeling of shame cannot survive. Shame, she says, depends on me buying into the belief that I'm alone. Shame cannot survive being spoken. It cannot survive empathy. This sermon is the first in a series of sermons we're preaching during Easter. The series' focus is on women of the Scriptures. I realize I didn't talk much about Eve as a person, as a character in Scripture. In fact, Isha doesn't even have the name Eve yet. The thing is, when Pastor Brendan and I decided on which characters from Scripture to include in this series and decided to include Eve, this important aspect of the story called to me. I had to talk about the destructive power of shame. And I had to talk about the antidote that Brene Brown identifies. Breaking the silence, unmasking the secrecy with someone who will listen empathetically, with someone who will remind you that you are worthy and of God's amazing, unconditional love. Amen.